Thank you for coming, for signing on. Thank you for being here. This is a collection of sources I developed over a period of a few years, really trying to think about a theology for peace, and particularly in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Obviously, something that we're really in the thick of, and not something where very many people are thinking about peace right now. But I think it's actually I think it's still important, and maybe I'll begin with I'll share my ani ma'amin. Okay, this is the thing that I believe, really with emunah shlema. Okay, like really very fully, and this is as follows: um the fates and the destinies of 7 million Israeli Jews and 7 million Palestinian Arabs are linked and are fully intertwined and meshed with one another, and and I think are likely to be that way forever. And I think that means that the pro-Israel or pro-Palestine dichotomy is inherently a false dichotomy, which is only possible to maintain if you look with a very narrow focus. Um, Now, sometimes it's very important to look at a narrow focus. If somebody is trying to kill you, that tends to narrow one's focus, and that's necessary. But right, if somebody's trying to kill you, you right now, today, you should kill him first. But there is no way that the children or grandchildren or great great grandchildren of the 7 million Israeli Jews will be able to live lives of peace and security and dignity and freedom unless the children and grandchildren, great grandchildren of 7 million Palestinian Arabs are also living lives of peace and security and dignity and freedom, and vice versa. So there's really no way that one can care about the welfare of one without also being really equally invested with love, fierce love for the welfare of the other, because the fates of these two people are linked. The question is overcoming the short term and getting to the long term. So that I don't know how to do that. But I think it's valuable to sketch out sort of a religious vision of what that might look like. And so I just want to start by sort of, when I first time I taught some of these sources, I taught them as like a second part of a two-part. The first part was like really like going through some of the halakhic material of the kind of whole Land for Peace debate, which is a lengthy halakhic literature on that, which I think is, it's Torah and worth studying. But I think it's a discourse and a paradigm which has some weaknesses. I listed three of them here. One, Land for Peace creates a false dichotomy, which Jews need peace and Arabs need land. I think Jews need land, Arabs need peace. Everyone, right? It's the framing of one for the other. I think sets up a strange dynamic, which I don't think is necessarily helpful. Two, historically, it presumes a secular orientation, pushing both sides to go aspects of their identity. And that's certainly true historically about who were the architects of Oslo on both the Palestinian and the Israeli side. I heard a story about I guess it was the 20th anniversary, so 93, 20 years later was 2013. There was like a reunion in Madrid of the diplomats who had been involved in negotiating the Oslo Accords, and they met in Madrid, and and I think it was like a Chazer treif banquet, like lot treif, not a single kosher item on the menu, and everyone ate. The Jews and the Muslims both these were not religious people, and which just in that's like a symbol of a kind of just like deeply traditional religious communities. Like, how could they are not going to make peace if the people representing them are so alienated from where they come from. And I think also it indicate that is how, my memory at least of what those years were like. This was these enlightened secular political leadership were going to sort of take Israel into the Paris, book the new Middle East, and we're going to forget about tribal attachment to our land, and we're going to sort of we don't need it anymore. We can give up territory and embrace peace, and which was linked to like a very secularizing, modernizing vision, which was threatening to people's sense of identity. And I think there was similar dynamics on the Muslim side, Palestinian side as well. The other kind of problem with land for peace paradigm is that it led to a calcification for many years up until this past October, where the status quo was not bad enough to kind of inspire people to make difficult changes, and so that sort of blew up in a horrific way, and so that I would say is like a third kind of challenge, and so we had this bizarre dynamic where, ostensibly pro-Israel speakers would come to America and they would say, well, actually, in the Israeli public, nobody cares about the Palestinian issue. It's not an issue in our elections. And that was somehow that was supposed to be a pro-Israel argument, which, and it came across, in my mind, it came across as really callous to is Palestinian suffering, also callous to Israeli suffering, which there were quite a few, as obviously as we know, Israeli victims of this conflict, in the past decades as well, many, grievous numbers. So that's is there a new different paragraph? I'm going to share the source packet again for those who joined a little bit later, so you have it too. So second source is a long excerpt from a piece. Rowie Ravitsky wrote something. He was involved with a project called the Religious Peace Movement. This is an organization called Mosaica. Michael Melchior sort of directs it. A lot of the direction is done by others, including a person I know well, whose name I can't remember right now, but convening religious leadership of various religions in the Middle East to try to engage in really valuable peacemaking. We're very successful in limited ways over the last decades. Roy Ravitsky, so involved one of the projects that he created this document about how could religious Jews be more invested in peacemaking in contemporary Israel. And I found it absolutely just a really compelling document. So I have excerpts on the source 3 and source 4, excerpts from that essay, but you have a link and Professor give links as well to that essay. I'm not gonna read it to you right now. You can read it yourself. I'll read just a little pieces. Yeah. So like, for example, so like, and this is like today's news. We have the Hamas counter proposal for the ceasefire negotiations. One of their demands is a return to the 2003 status quo on Har HaBayit. And we're sort of, and there have been a lot of changes to the status quo in recent years, and numbers since 2003, and it's a very contentious. It's our holiest site, and it's a very important site in Islam, and also important site in Palestinian identity. There was I saw on Facebook this week a Chayal who came back from Gaza. He said, I'm going to buy a picture of the Beit HaMikdash and put it up on my wall, because every single home that I was in Gaza had a picture of Al-Aqsa on the wall. And so we have to have that, cultivate that as well. So it's the spot that has, right? So we think of it, okay, well, only one side could have sovereignty. And this is one of the issues that the negotiations fell apart in 2000 and over this location. So Ravitsky writes, is this a foregone conclusion? It has to be. This is the second paragraph in source 3. According to hello, a prominent Jerusalem sheikh, there was no problem with Jews coming to pray in the mosque's esplanade. They can even build themselves a synagogue there and worship Allah in their own way, but this cannot be said aloud, because right now it's not a question of religious law that we are discussing, but rather the less important and more urgent one of who the proprietor is. As long as the Jews do not come to pray, but rather to demonstrate ownership and continue the occupation, we cannot give them a foothold. The Sheikh offers a different paradigm from the one we have become accustomed to, and according to his words and philosophy, there is an inverse relationship between Israel's sovereignty and control over the Temple Mount and the freedom of Jews to worship on it. It would be intriguing to see what certain religious groups would decide were there a choice between the current situation in which Israel has sovereignty but is limited in its ability to operate on the ground, and a hypothetical one in which Israel gives up its sovereignty, thereby creating a situation that actually increases the capacity of Jews to fulfill their religious aspirations. So, this is not, I don't know if Anne was talking about this, but it just shows how there's a language that religious personalities can speak that is different from the language of politicians, and that not everything has to be zero sum when you just have you're different axes to kind of to navigate, right? Like it could be Like God could have sovereignty, right? Like you could, that's hard for secular negotiators to kind of to propose, but it's something that religious individuals, even of different faiths, could take very seriously. Um, I think from the Jewish side, it's interesting, there's sort of like we will take it for granted that the Beit HaMikdash couldn't be rebuilt without destroying the Dome of the Rock. But I don't know why not? Why can't it be incorporated? Why can't it be next? Like who knows? Why presume a sort of zero-sum dynamic just because that's how we've seen things? I think religious individuals should have a more expansive set of possibilities of what they can consider. Um, Yeah, so then source 4, the next page, continuing from that same article, relates to the issue of Islamic recognition of the legitimacy of Jewish sovereignty in what is considered in Islamic law to be Islamic land, and which is the barrier to Muslim acceptance of Israel. But the second paragraph on this page, a possible alternative may emerge by moving away from the proposed solution, in this case, the dismantling of all state borders and the repudiation of any non-Muslim sovereignty, towards uncovering the religious motivation driving it. A prominent religious authority in the Islamic movement in Israel maintains that the anticipation of an Islamic caliphate does not necessarily conflict with recognition of an independent Jewish state. Suppose the caliphate is established and Jews remain living in it. After all, in Islamic law, they are entitled to live, manage their affairs on their own, reside in their own community, which with their own legal system. What prohibits them from doing it as a collective and calling it a state? In other words, we assume you can't have a Islamic caliphate and a Jewish state of Israel, but why? Why do you have to assume that? Say there's a reestablished caliphate from Baghdad to Morocco, and the caliphate delegates to the Jews. Their self-government, and they call it a state and have a flag. And why is that? Why can't that happen? And this unnamed sheikh, since this was written, I believe this is Sheikh Raed Badr, who is a senior postic of the Israeli Islamic movement, and like, highly regarded beyond Israel. He published a book length like Tshuva, expanding this idea. This happened a few years ago. He came to Washington. I was at a conference in Washington a few years ago where he presented this to a group of rabbis. And so I think based on this sort of argument. So I think there is again a possibility of, and he, the Islamic movement in Israel sat in, let's say, yes, Bell, go ahead, Bell. Yeah.
Why can't it work the other way around?
Hinami, yeah, maybe you could, for sure. Yeah. I
We
agree.
have a Jewish state with Arab caliphates, if you want to call them that, in the middle of it.
Yeah, I think that is possible. I think with goodwill and peace, there's many ways to accommodate people's like there's a proposal, called, the one homeland, two state, where you would have where people could live wherever they want and they'd be citizens of the state that is accords their identity, and then no one has to be moved and no one has to leave where they live, and everyone can feel full attachment to the entire historic Palestine, entire Eretz Yisrael Hashlema, and no one, and that's relatively easy to, just in your vote and wherever your citizenship is. That requires just, obviously requires peace and goodwill for people to live side by side with their erstwhile enemies. So that's not an easy thing to get to.
In either direction, it requires
in both
goodwill.
directions. People have to overcome. I think mutual goodwill, I think, is required, right? To people to
the caliphate paradigm that's laid out there. Yes, that also requires goodwill.
Yeah, but yeah, Sherry.
Hi. What you just said about, the Iachinami there, why couldn't there be caliphates with it?
Yeah.
That doesn't work for them, actually.
Oh, I see. You're saying it's not true. It's not true that
it doesn't fit with the walk of concept.
I see. Yeah, the concept is that all of the historic Muslim lands has to be Muslim, and so we can't say that. So they have to. Yeah, so maybe we see it, but we don't have to see it the same. We don't have to see it as we don't have to consider it the same way. Like we could, they could say, they could consider, that the caliphate extends from from Baghdad to Morocco, and they're delegating to us the autonomy to have a Jewish state, and we consider, no, we can consider ourselves being the sovereign, rulers of a Jewish state, and we're arrogating to a Muslim minority the rights to self-government. I think we could. There's a way. I think there's a way in.
You have to read the guy's book.
Once you're thinking halakhically, there's a way to be a little bit like you can. if you're thinking halakhically and you're willing to like wink a little bit, you can actually have like conflicting. We do it all the time, right? In halakha, right? You can sort of have somewhat conflicting realities that are, yeah, that right, and you can sort of, yeah, we're just gonna, we'll see it this way, we'll see it that way, and okay, but right? I think that's, okay. Next, okay, another sort of passage I found very powerful in source 5, just which rejects it, which sort of goes back to sort of the secular nature of the dynamic, the secularizing and secular nature of Oslo, of just which was very threatening on an identity level to religious Jews, separate from the actual content of what the negotiations were. So, the camp that currently fiercely opposes the peace agreement is the one that will end up paying for it with the total eradication of its life work when the time comes, meaning the evacuation of settlements, while the camp that is proudly leading peace efforts will end up paying nothing at all. In this situation, the political debate in Israel has ceased to be a mere dispute about necessary policy measures when those that stress the importance of compromise do not themselves have to make any concessions. Any victory for them would mean overwhelming defeat for an entire political and ideological camp. Those who seek to increase support for an agreement should ask themselves what price its supporters may have to pay and how its opponents might benefit from it. Right? The peace-loving cosmopolitans in Tel Aviv do not feel at loss of evacuating settlements in the Shomron. I think, for the most part, I think it's true. So it's what's the compromise? They're giving us something to care about. Conversations with various prominent religious Zionist rabbis reveal that in their minds, support for the establishment of a Palestinian state casts doubt on the future Jewishness of the state of Israel, and thus offers compelling evidence of malicious intent. A particular channel that might allay their concerns in this area involves compensation in the form of an increased emphasis on the Jewishness of the state in other areas. The rabbi of a settlement in the Hebron Hills maintains that increasing Jewish education in the non-religious public school system would make territorial concessions easier for him and his followers, I guess, to swallow. If you want to take away my home, promise that you'll let me into yours. I'll bring a backpack filled with a Talmud. If you pledge that you'll sit down together, the whole family, to learn in your living room, then I'll consider agreeing to pack my bags. Otherwise, a country without Judea, in what way would it be Jewish? I don't know. I find that very compelling, and I think there is an interesting there over the last decade. There's I think a positive trend of more Jewishness among non-Orthodox Israelis, and in really creative, interesting, innovative ways. And I think
state sponsored. This is talking about state sponsored.
no, like that's it. Maybe not. I don't know. Some of it is, some of it isn't, and maybe not. I think the political conflict sort of puts a lid on that and sort of keeps it from blossoming in many ways. I don't know what it would mean. I don't know what it would mean. Like, an extra, we'll evacuate this, but an extra hour a day of limited. I don't know. I don't know what it would mean, and I'm suspicious of many of the efforts to inject Jewish identity right now in the Israeli public. There's a lot of these Orthodox organizations that are currently doing Jewish identity curricula units in the Israeli non-Orthodox public school system are folks that are, I don't know, I wouldn't really want to have much access to my kids, frankly, but the dynamic, again, of just from zero sum to something where like win-win, right? Like, what do you like? If everyone's compromising, then everyone should compromise. If it's a painful compromise, then it should be a painful compromise. Are you having trouble seeing? Is the link opening for you?
No, now I found it.
Okay, great. Okay, so I want to sort of share that. Is that sort of I think religious individuals have there's a capacity of religion to evolve in really creative ways, and when tapped and when incentivized, I think religion can be incredibly creative. I mentioned before the Israeli Islamic movement, right? This is the movement that had Mansour Abbas sit not just in the Knesset, but be a cabinet minister in the last government, which is and you heard his statements in the last 4 months. Incredible courage, incredible moral clarity. Like, he's a real hero. Mansour Abbas, so he's the political disciple of the Israeli Islamic movement. the fellow I just mentioned wrote that psak, that book-length psak. His Rebbe is the founder of the Israeli Islamic movement, who died some years ago. At his funeral, Rav Melchior came and his rabbinic colleagues who sort of worked with him in interfaith dialogue. Mansour Abbas, of course, was there as his Rebbe's funeral. And Hespedim were called in from Khalid Meshal, who was the Hamas head, because Hamas and the Israeli Islamic movement are they're like cousin. They both have the same. They're both branches of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're like cousin movements. So there's a tremendous ability of people with very, very similar origins to just go in very, very different ways with different settings and different incentives. It's not the religion, it's not the ancient texts, it's how they're expressed. It's not the DNA, right? We all have. I heard. I took many years in college. I took a course with Stephen Jay Gould. It was like his biology for poets class, and he said that there's arguments that are made that people often say that sort of a biological reductionism, that murder and rape and genocide are sort of baked into human DNA, and so it's sort of this there in our in what we do. And he said that that's a misunderstanding of DNA. Like everything that human beings do is in our DNA, but so also compassion and solidarity and brotherhood and love, those are also in our DNA, because they're also things that human beings are capable of. And the question is, what are the circumstances where different capacities get expressed? I think the same is true for traditional religions. Our texts are our DNA, and they can be expressed in really very different ways under different settings and different contexts. And that's the more question. It's not the texts themselves. I think I think he's okay. Next. So another sort of theological point, which I find very powerful, and I think this is again, it's anonymous. This is Ravitsky again with an anonymous rabbi. I think this might be Rav Froman, Alav Shalom, who said this, or one of his students. And if we as Jews believe that our return to the Holy Land to establish a state in it is part of the divine plan and the fulfillment of the prophecy, then we must also believe that the presence of another people in the land is part of the same divine plan. On the basis of this belief, it's clear to me that we must resolve the conflict between us, not because fate has decreed that we must live here together, because we are fortunate that fate has destined us to live here together and fulfill God's will. This is a religious Zionist theology of peace, that sentence, right? I think religious Zionism distinguishes itself by its belief that God acts in history, that the return to Zion is a manifestation of God's will, that we should return to our ancient homeland in this time through human initiative. So once you believe that, then you also add on to that story the fact that God brought us back to a fully inhabited land, and our task is not to dispossess the inhabitants, but to learn to live together. That's the messianic story. And I think that I think when that happens, I actually do believe that will change the world. Right? I think just given the focus of the world on this territory, given how intense the conflict is and how bloody and violent it has been, when it is overcome, I think the world's going to be transformed. So this is a story. So again, the story doesn't get you the dilemma. The reality is really grim. It's really awful. I don't know how to get there, but it's a story that we can tell ourselves. I think that's what we need to, because right now I think you see polling going back years now. The religious public in Israel, I think a sizable minority, if not the majority, are in favor of expelling even Arab citizens of Israel. That's Pew did a study, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was 78% of religious Zionists, right? Because right now the story is God brought us back, and so it's for us, and we should be here, and there's no place in our story for anyone else. But maybe God brought us back to a land where other people live. That is part of God acting in history. You can't accept part of one part and not recognize the other is also part of that story. So I think perhaps this is Ravitsky quotes us in that piece as an anonymous rabbi. I think it might be Rav Menachem Froman. Rav Menachem Froman was a really interesting person. I met him once or twice. He was the rabbi of Tekoa, which is a settlement in the hills east of Gush Etzion. He was a mystic. He was a poet, and he was very invested in interfaith dialogue. And he felt that specifically the settlers are the ones to do it, because the settlers live amongst the Palestinian population, intertwined with them, and they're the ones who are going to be the ones, therefore, to make peace with their own neighbors. And he went to when Sheikh Yassin, the founder of Hamas, was released from prison in 1998, Rav Froman went to the rally in Gaza, to be with him. Like they met frequently, which did not make him very popular in Tekoa, but he like that just in terms of like who he would be willing to meet with to the sake of negotiating peace. And he other thing, his daughter-in-law was the victim of a stabbing attack in, I think, Tekoa a few years ago, and she survived, and she wrote about her experience of like looking into the eyes of the kid who stabbed her, tried to kill her, and sort of really, I think, hoping for his sake that she wouldn't die. And when she recovered, that sort of motivated her to become also like more of a peace activist, and she founded a group focused in West Bank settlements of trying to like engage in their Palestinian neighbors in peace and efforts and interactions, peer-to-peer, whatever, person-to-person interactions. I think she's also a very inspiring person. She said she got into peacemaking when she married. Like she came with her last name when she took her husband's last name when she got married, and that's how she got. Those are her credentials for being a peace activist. I saw him in a few years earlier. This was in 2005, 2006. It was a big conference in Madrid, in Seville. It was called Rabbis and Imams for Peace, which was just like this big conference that the Ford Foundation, I think, paid for like a whole bunch of people to go. I was a student at the time. They had a grant for a few students to go as well. And it was really, really interesting. Rav Froman was there, Sheyesh Cohen, like some senior rabbis, I think senior Islamic people as well. And it was interesting to see him in action. Like people really knew him. Like he was a figure. Okay, many people cannot accept that the call to freedom can also be a religious matter. I have his book. This is from a book I have. This is my translation. Despite what the rabbis taught that there is no free person other than the one who is involved in Torah, most religious people are still educated to believe that they must renounce their freedom for the sake of religion. This is found in other spheres. For example, in the political sphere, most settlers think that settlements are an obstacle to peace. Rather, they prefer settlement to peace. They cannot understand the settlements are for the sake of peace. And so too between men and women. Many men think that to be free is to be single, and to get married is to give up your freedom for the sake of a woman, relationships, children, house, etc. But for me, freedom is itself a religious value, and my wife is my freedom. As the poet said, with you I know that I am only free with you. At this point, Rav Froman would begin to sing and to cry. And settlements are fingers of a hand outstretched in peace and that protect peace. At this point, he would show his hand and how when one shakes hands, one's fingers are in the palm of the other person, and he compared them to settlements that exist in the heart of the Palestinian population. That was his, that's next quote from him, Rav Froman. And so I don't know, that seems, I think for many people, it's a little, I don't know, like he's a mystic. As a rationalist, it's hard to like kind of right. But he's right, but he's a mystic. Like he was a real, that he really believed, like he believed it and he did it, right? And he did it. I once met a Palestinian man who studied Zohar with Rav Froman. It was like really, it's incredible. Yeah, like that's really okay. It's verse 8. And in truth, this was a significant matter for him, Rav Froman Zal, that he turned to constantly in his speech and his actions. How can faith not turn into opacity? And in this regard, he constantly quoted what Bialik wrote, I shall go into the field and hear what God has said from the sheaves. And he said this, this is true humility. And he returned to this many times and said, humility is reality, not to live in our preconceived notions. Like let's be humble. Let's be what to learn from the world, from reality. And so it was in many spheres. For example, in the political sphere, once he saw one of the students in the yeshiva who was going around with a t-shirt that said on it, if there are no Arabs, there will be no terror attacks. And he turned to him and in front of everyone said, and what should we do when there are Arabs? What do we do when there are? And he repeated and said this many times, that the basis for any political thinking is that unlike our ideological prior assumptions, the Holy Blessed One placed us in a land that has Arabs. This is reality. This is what Hashem says to us to know from the sheaves. This is why I think Rav Froman maybe was that anonymous source that Ravitsky found. Okay, you gotta confront reality. You have to, right? That's, if God is guiding us, if God brought us here, then this is what God brought us to the midst of, and we have to respond to reality and deal with it. Okay. And he particularly emphasized this point at the end of his life when his illness was revealed to him. The doctor said it was an advanced stage. He didn't have cancer. He didn't have much time to live. And he immediately began to prepare himself for death. And he learned and taught about this from the Zohar and other books. And many people around him, from the family and among his students, tried to encourage him, saying that he should not despair and should believe that he could still emerge from his illness and live. And he said, everything is possible for the blessed God to do. And then he continued to prepare for death. And I saw by him, from the one hand, penetrating understanding of the facts, with all the difficulty they contained and full acceptance of reality. On the other hand, this gaze did not turn him into someone who despaired or to someone who was passive. The opposite was true. It was as if he celebrated his illness. He learned with curiosity and with diligence what God was saying to him from the pains of his body. One could feel how it was that it is what it is, did not diminish his belief that God can do everything. And this is a great spiritual innovation. He used to repeat the joke that he heard from his father about a chassid from Gore, who was on the verge of death. And when he was truly on his deathbed, his friend bent over and whispered, Laser, say a Shechianu blessing. It's the first time you're dying. Okay. Good, right? So reality, okay? So a mystic who believes anything is possible, but also rooted in reality. And part of the reality is like, here we are in a land with other people. And like, that has to be part of our thinking. That has to be part of our story, our theology, like this, whatever the story we tell, the mythic story of return has to make space for another people as well. That's the reality God's showing us. It's religious not to ignore reality, it's to accept reality, even as one is imagining a different reality, or the potential for something different. Okay.
Question, just to
yeah.
help me like frame it.
Yeah.
So Neturei Karta, who reject Jesus,
What's their religious basis for that?
That'd be a great class to teach. Religious anti-Zionism. So look, the story they tell, and this is like the standard Jewish story for that every Jew told, was that we sinned and we were expelled from Eretz Israel, and when we repent, or at the end of days, Mashiach will come and bring us back. And
so
until
it's just not time.
and until then, when we went to exile, we took 3 oaths, and one of the oaths was not to rebel against the nations and not to ascend and try to recapture Israel by force. And this was an oath that was impressed upon us who went to exile, and this is binding, and that's their story. Zionism is a revolutionary, different story. And religious Zionism is also a revolutionary, different story.
Okay, so the religious Zionist different story in contrast
is that
it's our duty and it's a mitzvah to go to.
Yeah. So the oaths maybe weren't true, or maybe the oaths, there was also an oath that God put on the Gentiles not to oppress us too much, and they broke their oath, so we don't have to be bound by ours. Or maybe the Balfour Declaration or the UN Partition Plan represents a permission from the nations to go back, and so the oaths are not in that sense are not restricting us. That's like a religious Zionist response to that narrative, but it's a different story, right? It's a different story, right? You go to a Jew in 1800 or 1700 or 1500, right? I mean, it's in the Siddur. Because of our sins, we're exiled from our land. And you say, how are you going to go back? And so and that, right? So that's
right. And the story is Mashiach, right?
That would be the story they would tell. I think that you asked a Jew on the street, how are you going to go back? That's what they would tell. I mean, it's a little more complicated. There were Jews who moved back. The Ramban came to Eretz Israel, and there were like always Jews moving to Eretz Israel throughout history, but as like a mass, but most Jews I think would say that do not anticipate a political return led up with human initiative. So
looking at it from a purely religious, theological perspective, the religion on one side, the reality on the other side, it's almost more convincing that the Neturei Karta is almost more convincing.
You find them almost more convincing.
I mean, just as a theological exercise.
It's a simple story.
It's so simple and it seems so factual on the
ground.
Right.
Right.
But it's just not our narrative. Like it's
Yeah.
just not our story. And like
Yeah, it's
the
interesting.
vast majority of us are
Yeah.
Zionist, that's accepted, but
Yeah.
from the simplicity of the religion of it, it seems that religiously that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, they have a good story, but well, look, the Neturei Karta is crazy. There's some broader Orthodox non-Zionist, there's also the more mainstream Haredi non-Zionism, which is we'll treat Israel like any other state, where we'll be, we'll live here and we'll, be good citizens as best we, we're still in exile. We're not treating the state as like a relevant factor in our religious identity. That's sort of also a position as well. That's also a story. That one I think is maybe less tenable because they're pretty invested now. Like it's, You can't.
It sounded good, but the reality is.
No, because they're a huge percentage. I mean, this is Yair Lapid gave a speech a few years ago where he went to a Haredi audience and he said, "You won. Like we thought that we were going to replace you." Ben Gurion gave a few hundred yeshiva students draft exemptions because like he thought this won't exist in a few years. Meir Sharm is a museum, and like it's not, but like you won. Like now, but because you won, you have to like take responsibility for you got to like contribute more, be integrated to the economy, and take responsibility for the state in a fuller way. And I think that maybe. I saw there's yet another tangent. We'll come back. I saw it's a fellow. He had a WhatsApp group where he's a scholar of the history of the Siddur, and eventually he publishes as a book, but it started as a WhatsApp group where he would write about a different Siddur each week, and like its history and publication history and what it was like really interesting. So he subsequently published I think 2 volumes of books of the history of different Siddurim, like each like chapter is like a different Siddur and its history. So he's been fighting in the reserves. He's like in his 30s, I think. So he's like been drafted into the reserves and he's been fighting. And he posted on Facebook and said, like I'm a scholar of Siddurim. I will never again use a Siddur that doesn't have a mishabeh, like a tefillah for Chayalei Tzahal. So like that was like I don't know that right. I thought that spoke to me. I don't know that was a moving position. Okay. Let's look at some Rav Shigar. Rav Shigar, super interesting person. I don't know, maybe touched on him before in some other settings. He also died young from cancer. Was also I think connected in some ways to Rav and also like he lived also in Gush Etzion area at the end of his life. He was with associated also with a more mystical mystical postmodern trend in postmodern religious Zionism. Rav Shigar is like the figure who kind of created that. Like he didn't have a university education, but he read, somehow he got access to some postmodern books and wrote a book called Kelim Shavarim, Shattered Vessels, which is subsequently published in. We had people from his yeshiva come and speak here a few months ago, and they left a book for the library. It's a really interesting. I think he's super interesting and his books are now being translated into English. Like he wrote very little during his lifetime. His students have spent the last 10 years publishing a lot of his things into Hebrew, like just preparing it for publication. And some of that is now being translated into English. Hasuka, Shehi Dirat Arai, Galutit, Ach Gam Mevatet et Chag HaAsif HaEretz Yisraeli, Hagalutiyut Nimsechet El Toch Hashirshiyut Artzit Yeshba Kedei Ma'aneh L'Shelot Kashot Hamit Ororot Im Chazarnu Shel Am Li'arso. It's a very complicated. Okay, the Sukkah, which is a exilic temporary structure, also expresses the harvest festival of the land of Israel. Hagalutiyut, exileness, continues into the midst of being rooted in our land. Right, we celebrate the harvest festival of our homeland by remembering and celebrating our existence as exiles with no, wandering exiles. That's Sukkot. Right? It's like this contradiction, right? This very good postmodernism. So this is a response to many hard questions that arise with the return of the people to its land. What happens when the power relationships change? What happens when this people spread out without power across the whole world, all of a sudden comes back and establishes its power and becomes sovereign in a defined territory? His story shell Eretz Shanim. Do we remember what it was like to be this, defeated people wandering from land to land? Yachas minukar v'iyun l'toshavim hazarim b'kirban, right? As a foreign element to every place we lived. Umevan yoter concrete and a more concrete, right? Okay. Ha'im chazarto shel Am Yisrael lepolitika ha'olamit she'ota azav me'ones sheyesh baratzon pnimi. Tovilo lehityaches lezar hachai b'kirbo k'fi shityachasu elav umotolam kasher gala b'artzotehem. Will the return of the Jewish people to politics mean that we will treat the stranger in our midst the way we were treated as strangers in the lands where we lived? Okay, Kuzari has, and he's quoting, he's a reference here to a very famous pastor, Rav Kook. Rav Kook wrote that, the father of religious Zionism, one of the fathers of religious Zionism, that we left our land and we left behind warfare and politics and sovereignty against our will, but also by our will, because we recognize that it wasn't appropriate for Israel to exercise sovereignty during the Dark Ages. In order to be like Jacob, shouldn't have to use the tools of Esav. And only now, he wrote in the 20th century, when the dawn of a new age is coming, where warfare is a thing of the past, where it's possible for nations to exist and to thrive without the need for warfare and political trickery. Now it's appropriate. That's why we're returning to our land. So he was wrong about the 20th century, but he was, Rav Kook was, he was sort of taken in by he thought World War I was the war to end all wars. And he was like, he was kind of cat butt. So the Seder, okay, so the question then returns. The Kuzari has two, Kuzari is this imaginary dialogue between this Chacham and the king of the Khazars, okay, and it's like an argument for Judaism, framed as this dialogue. So there are two questions that the Khazar king asks the Chacham, who is Yehuda Levi, the author of the book, that he can't answer. The first question is, if you love Eretz Yisrael so much, why don't you live there? And the second question is, you only think you're better than everyone else because you've had no power. And if you had power, you'd be no different than us. And those are the two questions that he has no answer for. So that's what I think Rav Shigar is expressing in this passage. Will we become evil when power passes to our hands? Right? Like the Maharal says that because we have no nation, we live everywhere, we are the root of the world, we have this special purpose as being a people who have no location because we're spread out all over. And that, okay? מלכודרת העורבת לו. הדרך לארץ ישראל העוברת דרך הגלות יכולה לרכך את עם ישראל שקם ונהיה ריבון לשמור את שייכותו לארבע רוחות השם. So the answer is we have to return to our homeland by recognizing we truly have no homeland and we're cosmopolitan, belong for all places. Like we were relevant to no place and to one place at the same time. And the sukkah, and that's the sukkah symbolizes that. Like it's about we remember we were strangers and had no land while we celebrate the harvest festival of this particular land, and that's maybe the way to we could avoid that. Okay. This is a essay which there's a collection in English of essays of sort of reflection of Shigar about Zionism. And so another beautiful, I think it's really beautiful. He writes that about Hatikva as this beautiful expression of, unlike other anthems, it's an anthem. Can you explain why Rav Shigar was so critical of evacuation? Yeah, I think my understanding is that the question, well, can you explain why Rav Shigar was so critical of evacuation of the settlements in Gaza in 2005? So my understanding is that he felt that it was a decision made by the government that had not been voted on by the people, that they had not campaigned on it, and so they were elected without that being part of their platform, and so they didn't really have a democratic mandate to do this, and it was never put to a vote. I think that was part of what upset him, but the trauma sparked a lot of interesting thoughts in him. He was not a liberal or a leftist, but he was I don't know, but he was a creative thinker about statehood and sovereignty. So Tikva, he says it's mournful and it's about hope for the future, not about pride in what we have. And that's, I think, it's all the yearning for, okay? The second paragraph of source 11, there's something deeply strange about this anthem. Most other anthems, as I mentioned, celebrate victories, and they have proud, bombastic tunes. They're meant to inspire confident, patriotic national identity. The Tikva inspires a national identity of meek hope, confident in the future, but not in the present. Inspiring that identity in the citizens of a sovereign state is paradoxical, even radical departure from the norm. For Shigar, it opens up the possibility of exile within the home, of maintaining the good things we learned from exile, even after returning to the land. So he thinks that Tikva is like an expression of that Sukkot theme. Like our anthem is not about how great we are and our victories and our land. It's about the yearning for return. And so we have to, how can we retain that yearning for that yearning, that hope, even as we're sovereign? That's the challenge. That's the Sukkah. Okay. 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 Finally, we'll look at a Gemara, and then this will end. Okay. This is another attempt at a theology, okay, of a theology of peacemaking and reconciliation. And I've heard this from also from a I can't Rabbi Gisser, I think the rabbi of a big Jewish community in the middle of the Shomron, and he taught this. He's one who sort of shared this with me in this context. Amr Papa Hainu Da'amri Inshe Rahit Venafel Tura Ve'azil V'Shadi Le Susia Ve'Ore. Okay, so what people say? An ox runs and falls, its owner goes and casts a horse in its place. So you really want the ox to be in your field working, but the ox, injures itself, so you can't use the ox. You put a horse there. The horse will also pull a plow, not quite as well as an ox, but you can use a horse to pull a plow. What does Rashi say? Ride the Nathal Torah, the ox runs and falls. V'azo shadi susia, you put the horse in its place. Kesheratz hashur v'nafal me'amida ma'amidin sus b'mkomo v'avuso mashalo haya rotzel asod kodem ma'falato shel shor shiachaviv alav shoro biyoter. Okay, like you really don't want to put have your horse pulling your plow because the horse isn't as strong as the ox. It's not going to do as good a job, but the ox injured itself. The ox is benched. Okay, you need to put something else. Kishemit rapeh hashor hayom olam achar mafalato kashelo lotzi suso mipnei hashor lachar shamidu sham. Okay, but once the ox gets better, you don't want to just get rid of the horse. The horse, now you feel some gratitude towards the horse. You feel some loyalty to the horse because it was pulling your plow when the ox couldn't do it. So we're not just going to discard the horse, okay? Because it did this thing for you. What? You're missing the metaphor?
It's assuming the horse wants to be there, and this is better for the horse somehow.
Yeah, like a basketball team.
Basketball team is better, yeah.
The horse in the
Okay. It doesn't always. Okay, I every metaphor has its flaws. Like there's no perfect metaphor. Okay.
I don't know if it's fun.
What's that? Let me finish the Rashi, and then it'll take Dan take a question. Okay. Kachach Baruch Hu kiven shira'ah mapalatan Yisrael no 10 gedula tol of de kochavim. Kechesh chozrim Yisrael b'tshuva nivigelin kashel aved of de kochavim b'pnei Yisrael. So Kadosh Baruch Hu, like he sort of lifted up the idolaters, the Gentiles, right? Once we were no longer able to fulfill our goal in history and do our job. So once we get better, God's it's sort of hard for him just to displace the Gentiles who are taking our place, right? Just like this. Okay, I think so. That's like they did nothing. The horse did nothing wrong. The horse was just was fulfilling a need that we couldn't, that the ox couldn't fill. So, there's no inherent conflict between the horse and the ox. Okay, the horse was doing something that the ox couldn't do for a period of time, and the owner feels gratitude towards the horse and doesn't want to displace it. Yes, Danny.
Just a couple of thoughts. Like, first of all, I think there would be, at least on my part, speak for myself, a great interest, like if there were, maybe a kind of more extensive set of classes at some point where we would kind of really engage with Rav Shagar's work. I know you say his students are kind of publishing his work. I'd be curious to know, what kind of actual impact is he having in the world of religious Zionism, if any? And then I would just say, it's just like personally speaking, I have grown so alienated from religious Zionism, and I think, one of the things that I find most in terms of just like this deification of the state and nationalism, it's like I don't support a kind of simple theodicy of everything is because of our sins. But I feel like we've lost the capacity to look at catastrophe at least as a kind of opportunity for some degree of self, examination. It's all like we are totally innocent, we are, blameless, we are without flaws, and like it just seems like how do you read the Haftorah? Like how do you? It's just such a perversion. It feels. I don't know.
Yeah, other, they're sort of related, but a little bit different. I really liked sort of the I think that's the second source. This sort of idea of like thinking on a different plane, right? You're sort of thinking halachically. You're and speaking to the kind of original point about like the land for peace also towards sort of a going in the direction of secularism and abandoning sort of this religious way of thinking. But it's sort of interesting to think about, the caliphate versus the Waqf and all that. You could sort of think about that, and it's totally inconsistent with sort of modern nationalism, right? And sort of this modern idea of sovereignty, in which sovereignty is by definition zero sum and has fixed borders, and there's one group that controls sovereignty and not the other. Religious Zionism has sort of integrated that concept, right? So that seems to be the sort of the catch here is that, right? Naturi Karta, we were talking about earlier, saying, no, we don't believe in this. We're keeping with our old sort of ideas before modern nationalism existed, right? Whereas religious Zionism has fully integrated this zero sum notion of modern nationalism into
So look, so nationalism existed, came into existence 150 years ago. What arose in history can pass away and can become and can merge into something better. I was very influenced by Timothy Snyder's writings about he's written about, he's a European historian, and I'm convinced he sort of made the point that the idea of a dependent nation state is a fiction anyway, and all those independent nation states that they created after World War I to create peace and stability and defend their national, they all were swallowed up by Hitler and Stalin in months, and they didn't protect and what has brought peace and to a degree and stability to a degree has been multinational EU, NATO, UN, like that's what's created stability, at least in Europe, more somewhat, in a way that independent nation states never did. And there was, he said, Brexit is creating an independent United Kingdom that has never existed historically, right? It was the empire, and it was, then it was integrated into the EU, and like this is something new that really never existed. It's like imagining anyway. So I'm not I think I don't think that I'm not convinced that nation states are a good idea. I certainly don't think they're the only way that human beings can figure out how to live across the earth. And I think there may be some, again, I think ways for cooperation and just creative thinking to overcome somewhat of what seem right now to be zero-sum games. Danny, so first of all, we can find a time and learn some Rav Shigar. I would love that. Let's find a time and invite some others to join us, and that would be really great. I sort of share your disillusionment with religious Zionism. I think if I felt there was a better, like a different community that was that, like all the things that I find lacking in religious Zionism, I think the Haredi community is worse. Like they're not more humanistic, you're right? Like so don't feel, so various times in the last few years, especially, like I don't know, like it's sort of that's I sympathize, but and again, I think the potential though of religions to reinvent themselves, I think, is really powerful, and that gives me some hope. And just if Mansour Abbas and Hamas are like 2 generations removed from the same religious organization, religious philosophy, I think it's I don't know if you want, but it's possible for like a great deal of creativity to exist also in Judaism, which we see, right, which that we have seen. And that sort of gives me hope. So I don't, I don't know Rav Shigar's influence on religious. I don't know. I mean, I would say when he was alive, I think his influence was very, very small. But like somebody is buying his books and paying for them to be published. And there's Yeshiva Tzach Yitzhak where they're really invested in his spirit and his way of thinking. And they have students and they have a campus, and so and they have partnerships with non-Orthodox Israel too. That's what they spoke about when they were here. They're really invested in trying to be part of a broader Israeli conversation about Judaism, which I think is very, very promising. Like I think they have an interesting voice to contribute to that conversation. Okay, thank you. I'm leaving for Israel tomorrow, so I'll see what I tell you what I find and tell you the answer. I'll come back with answers, I'm sure. And I'm gonna head to Marv now. Okay, thank you so much for listening. Good night. Thank you.